And our next guest comes from a prominent military family in Israel.
But a personal tragedy made him re-examine what he'd been brought up to believe about the conflict between his people and the Palestinians.
Miko Peled shares his story in the book The General's Son, and we'll give you information about a talk today that we really encourage you to go to. Welcome, Miko. How are you?
Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Tell us what you mean by a personal tragedy led you to question what you had been raised with, what you had been taught to believe your whole life.
Well, I was raised in a very patriotic Israeli family. I have a grandfather who's a signer of the Israeli Declaration of Independence and a father who's a general in the Israeli Armed Forces. So that's a lot of patriotism right there.
Yeah.
And that's what I was brought up what I was brought up with. And then in 1997, my sister's little girl was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem. And this, of course, it is an experience that you can't describe in words. It's so horrifying and shocking when a little girl gets killed. But after the funeral, when my sister came out to start to talk to people, I mean, this was big news, a lot of press came and so forth. When people asked about retaliation and things like that, she said, I don't want to hear about retaliation. She said, no real mother wants to see this happen to any other mother. And in terms of who's responsible, she said, well, because we, the Israelis, are maintaining such a brutal oppression and occupation against the Palestinians, this is the price that we pay.
Wow, that must have made headlines.
Right, that made a lot of headlines, of course. That's exactly it. She was turning everything upside down.
Yeah.
Her take, were you really surprised, and your own reaction from it?
Well, it was earth-shattering, really, to hear her say this, but it drove me to examine the conflict and to examine the things upon which I was raised. And I was already living here in the U.S. at the time. So I was very fortunate. I live in San Diego, and I found a Jewish-Palestinian discussion group. Now, I was born and raised in Jerusalem, but I never met Palestinians, even though it's a mixed city, because it's such a segregated city.
Right.
Of course, here in Memphis, we know about segregation.
Right.
And,
except it's much more segregated, right? I mean, there's...
It's very segregated,
right,
yes. And so here I was in San Diego for the first time meeting Palestinians who were actually my neighbors, you know. And it was also the first time I was sitting with Palestinians, and we were equal. In other words, the laws that apply to my life and their life were the same. That doesn't exist over there anywhere. Palestinians and Israelis are never living under the same laws, never live under the same laws anywhere there. So this was a very positive experience, a very powerful experience, and that led me to hear the Palestinian story, the Palestinian narrative, and then travel into Palestinian territories, which I'd never done before, even though the country is rather small and geographically we live close to each other. Because of segregation, we never travel.
Right. So you never know them as people.
Exactly. Never know them as people, didn't know the country, didn't know the language or the culture or their story, because they have an entirely different story that relates to this.
What is their story?
Their story is that the State of Israel was established after a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing. That the State of Israel was established after 12 years of a horrifying, what could only be described as a horrifying act of terrorism, at the end of which almost 2/3 of the population, the native population of Palestine, was forced into exile. And this is why we have refugee camps today. This is why we have a refugee problem in Gaza today. So
is
we
it
have to
similar
start
to what the Americans did to the Native Americans in the Palestinian view?
In many ways it is. In many ways it's a similar story of Europeans coming to colonize and taking over the land and the resources and placing the native community either forcing them to exile or into refugee camps and placing them under a reality that is very similar perhaps to South Africa, where you had an apartheid regime with laws for parts of the population and different laws for other parts of the population.
Miko, we have about a minute left here. As you well know, and we mentioned earlier, there's so many divided opinions when it comes to this subject.
Yeah.
Have you, though, from a personal standpoint, taken any heat for your opinion now about this matter?
I wouldn't say that I take heat. Certainly a lot of people don't like to hear this. They don't, criticizing Israel in America is not a popular thing. It's not a popular stance. But I always say I've made more friends than I've lost, because when you enter this into an issue like this, in this particular issue, you meet a lot of very good people who are interested in finding peace and finding justice and realizing that Israelis and Palestinians live in a beautiful place, and there's so much potential for them if they can live as equals. So that that path actually has enabled me to meet more people than I've ever met before, and really
perhaps it's the path to lasting peace.
it is the path. I believe it certainly is. I believe that equality, justice, human rights are the secret ingredients to exactly that, to peace, to lasting peace.
Okay, we just put the information on the screen there. Memphians for Peace takes place tonight at 5:45.
It's definitely a complicated issue, and you definitely should go and listen and ask questions.
Yeah, be a part of the conversation, the dialogue.
Absolutely.
That's the key, for sure.
Americans are
Thank you
highly
very much.
invested. Thank
We
you so
appreciate
much.
your time.
Thank you.